Thank you, Lord, for this day. May many more come. We thank you for all the blessings you have bestowed upon us. We ask that you watch over our family and constituents, wherever they may be, and also safe travel for all those that are traveling back home tomorrow, and be with everyone over the spring break. I ask all this in your holy and precious name, Lord. Amen.
Thank you, Mr. Blake.
Welcome, everybody. Today we have the public presentation on living wage with members from Alternative North. Before we go, well, just one agenda item. Can I have somebody move accept the agenda? Moved by Sonny, second by Julie. All in favor? Okay. Any declaration of conflict of interest? Seeing none, I will start on my left to get the committee to introduce themselves.
Good afternoon, Frederick Blake, MLA for Mackenzie Delta. Welcome.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. Julie Green, Yellowknife Center.
Good afternoon, Michael Nadley, MLA for Dutchell.
Kevin O'Reilly, Frame Lake.
Good afternoon, Shane Thompson, Nahendeh. On my left is Megan Welsh, our research analyst, and on our left, and I'm just drawing a blank there. Michael Ball. Sorry, Michael. You know, it's been a long time.
It's okay, I'm new here.
Yeah, Michael's only been here for the last 7 years. So Michael, he's our clerk of the committee. At this point in time, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm Suzette Montreuil with Alternatives North and my cohort, Ben McDonald. I hear this is the last day, so thank you for hearing us out this time. We're very happy to be able to present this information. So we're going to start with a review of the work that was done by Michelle Hayner, who's an economist in Grand Prairie. And then at the end, if you have any questions on the process, Michelle will be happy to answer. And if you have more questions about how this might work in the NWT or how it fits in, then we'd be happy to help you out with that. So I will turn it over to Michelle now.
Thank you. Ms. Hayner?
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm hoping that this works out okay with me not seeing you. Let me come to the questions. Please be patient with me as I know it's for me to hear a few people in the room. So I'll just alert you if I don't quite hear what you've asked. But on to the presentation. So as Suzette mentioned, you undertook a project to take a look at what the living wage was on most available information to reflect 2019 for 3 communities in the Northwest Territories. So I'm going to give an overview of that. If we look at slide 2, I'm also going to just, for the benefit of understanding the results, review a few aspects of living wage as well before we get to the results. So the outline for the presentation starts with a brief review of what living wage is, its typical purpose, and then we'll spend a little bit of time reviewing the calculation methodology, and then get on to the results piece. And then at the very end of the presentation, just to put the results for the NWT in context, I'll review some of the living wage estimates that have been developed for other communities in the last couple of years. So on to slide 3. So living wage, it's been defined in a number of different ways, and there are a couple presented on this slide. But overall, it essentially is taking a look at what that amount of employment income, and therefore the wage, is needed for a household to achieve a decent standard of living. With that standard of living, based on the assumption of a relatively conservative, what might be called bare bones budget, that includes some of those basic living costs like food, clothing, shelter costs, transportation, those things that are listed on the slide. on to slide 4. So what is the purpose of living wage? And living wage is actually quite an old concept, maybe not so much in Canada, but it's been around. The UK was probably the first country to take a look at living wage as an indicator of affordability and then as the basis for looking at different potential programs. But in Canada, it's probably been something more that came about in the last decade, starting in BC and Ontario. And overall, its purpose has been threefold. So one of the key things has been providing information at the community level. So at the community level, understanding the amount of income required to meet basic needs based on local living costs. And in that way, it becomes a potential indicator of living cost changes if it's tracked over time. As well as, because the framework incorporates, and we'll talk about that in the methodology section, government transfer programs, it can also provide an indicator of the local impact of government transfer programs. And then another key purpose of living wage is also for the development, based on the information it provides, community-based policy or programs. So there have been some communities in Canada, for example, that have created, and I think there's only 2 to date, but there's a couple communities in Canada that have established living wage bylaws at the local level, essentially stating that the local city government will pay all its employees as well as contractors a living wage rate. And then other communities in Grand Prairie, where I live, is an example of what have used living wage estimates to help inform whether they develop low-income access programs, such as subsidized bus passes or subsidized recreation programs. And they've used living wage to help inform whether the amount of that subsidy should change or not. And then a third key purpose of living wage that has emerged has been for advocacy purposes. So because it's an indicator of affordability, living wage can provide some information about whether the working poor are getting by on the wage rates that they're earning. It can help understand the context of minimum wage reviews and current minimum wages. And it can also provide some information to the employer community or business community about whether there would be benefit to providing more wages to their employees or supplementing their compensation through other means such as employee benefits. On to slide 5. So, with that in mind, it's actually important to understand what living wage incorporates, and that will help give a better idea of why it becomes a good indicator of affordability and suits those purposes I just reviewed. So currently, most communities that undertake a living wage estimate are using a Canadian living wage framework as a guide to their methodology. So the Canadian living wage framework came out about, well, I guess it's been out now for about 6 years, and it has guided, as I mentioned, most living wage estimates across Canada. It provides some principles that define some of the guidelines it establishes for the calculation of living wage. So it indicates within that what type of reference household should be examined. And typically it suggests that you reflect a household that is the most common one in Canada and generally the most common one in most communities. So that would be a couple with 2 children. And because it's specifically looking at wages and people that are in the workforce, you're looking at 2 working parents and assuming they're both working full-time. And those 2 children, the recommendation through the framework is that you look at one child that is not yet in school, so they're in age 3, or some estimates use age 4, but they're in full-time childcare. And then the second child would be in school and potentially accessing after-school care because of the need with 2 parents working full-time. That said, the living wage framework also suggests that you reflect local realities and you consider that in the estimation of living wage. So many communities recognize that the working poor in their community includes many lone parent families as well as potentially single adults. So many communities have made it their practice when they're looking at living wage to also look at a few other household types. And if you look, we're not going to review those results today, but if you look in the report or have had a chance, that was incorporated in this project as well. We're going to focus on that typical reference household today, but there are some comparisons for other household types for each community. The other thing I wanted to stress here is that because Inuvik was included as one of the communities examined, we wanted to reflect the demographics in that community in the estimates as well. And the latest data for Inuvik shows that about 2/3 of that population is Indigenous. So we wanted to reflect that in the calculation method. And it's important because I'm sure as many of you are very much aware, Indigenous people in the community of Inuvik have access to Aboriginal Head Start preschool programs for the younger child in the reference household. And the other important aspect is that Indigenous persons could access non-insured health benefits, and that will therefore affect their health care costs. So on to slide 6. So those of you that like math will love this slide. Those of you who don't like math will like this slide. So this actually details the formulas that are behind the living wage calculation. So this is the basis of the different steps that are undertaken when you're taking your different steps to get to that final living wage number. And it shows the different components that are incorporated. So to get at living wage, the first step is typically to look at the annual expenses of the household. Because you want to determine the amount of before tax employment income that they need to have a final take-home income that will allow them to cover all their annual expenses. So basically, when we're undertaking a calculation, we're trying to balance off the household annual expenses with their before tax employment income, and then adjusted for any government transfers that they qualify for and the taxes that they need to pay out. Once you determine and balance that equation, you have what's called the living wage level before tax employment income. Then that before tax employment income would be divided by the paid hours of work. And here in this project, we assume 37.5 hours a week of work. You would divide the total number for the whole year, so by the annual before tax employment income to determine the living wage rate. So with that said, on to slide 7, the calculation of the annual family expenses is really a key piece of the methodology. And this slide shows what type of things are included in the budget for the family, and then very importantly as well, certain things are excluded. Because we're just representing a reference household, it doesn't necessarily have all the types of expenses that some households might. And because we're taking a conservative approach to the budget, there are quite a number of things excluded, as you see in that list, that actually would be expenses for some families. But we're keeping it to what is really conservative, bare bones type budget. that includes that, all those things on that list. And on to slide 8. And now we get to the good part on what the results are, what's of interest. So as I mentioned, we're focusing here today on what the results were for that couple family, that reference household with 2 working adults and 2 children. So the results of the estimation are summarized here in this chart, the key piece of information being the actual living wage rate. So we can see here that there is some variation, as would be anticipated, since living costs vary across the 3 communities, in what the living wage rate is estimated to be. So for Yellowknife, I have just under $24. Hay River comes out at the highest rate at $24.75, and then Inuvik comes out just below the Yellowknife estimate. And I again want to emphasize and preface that estimate for Inuvik on what the assumptions we had on that reference household. It is very important to again highlight that we made the assumption that the family was Indigenous and therefore were eligible to have a preschool child in Aboriginal Head Start program, and they chose to do that. Therefore, that really brought down their child care expenses, and also that they utilized the non-insured health benefits program, and that brought down their health care expenses. So with the annual expenses being somewhat lower due to that, that is what had an impact on having a lower living wage rate for Inuvik. You'll see here in this chart as well, something I wanted to highlight is a key component to determine the living wage rate, as I explained in the previous slides, is the before tax employment income. You'll see the comparison between the communities there. All are above 90,000, which is, if you've ever had the interest or a chance to look at market basket measures or low income measures that Statistics Canada puts out, it's quite a lot, quite a margin above what those estimates are. And you'll see here in this chart too, is it reflects the other components of the living wage, the government transfers as well as the taxes, which I'm going to address in the next slide and give you a little bit more information about those pieces of the calculations for each community. So on to slide 9. So here we see a further breakdown of the annual expense calculations for each community. So on the left is showing you what each set of bars represents, and it is those key budget components that are part of that calculation methodology. I just, it would take probably too much time to get into the very specifics, but what I wanted to highlight here is that the shelter cost was the number 1 cost for all 3 communities reference households. So for a couple family with 2 children, and that the assumption there is that they're renting a 3-bedroom apartment. So for each of those communities is the highest cost element. The next highest cost for 2 of the communities is food cost. And then also a very high cost element for Hay River and Yellowknife is the child care cost. It's lower for Inuvik, as I mentioned, because we assume that the preschool child, for half of their care, is in Aboriginal Head Start. And then also you see reflected here, although it's not one of the higher cost components, the healthcare difference across the 3 communities based on those assumptions as well. On to slide 10. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but I just included this slide to highlight and to flag for myself to indicate where the cost estimates came from for those different pieces of the budget component. So the data sources that were used, NWT Bureau of Statistics was a data source using some components of the new market basket measures. So the market basket measure can be broken down into commodity groups, and so I used some of the estimates for the different commodity groups. And then also Statistics Canada data from the Survey of Household Spending provides some more specific detailed cost estimates for Yellowknife. And then some of the cost differentials across communities can be used to adjust those cost estimates for Yellowknife to the other communities. For healthcare, I got actual quotes online from a health insurance company, so that's what's reflected there in those private healthcare plans for the Hay River and Yellowknife cost estimates. And for childcare, use ECE data to get contact information for local providers and just did an informal survey of local providers in the different communities of what the costs were. Slide 11. Again, often there's questions about that budget component, social inclusion. So here I've broken down what's included in the social inclusion cost component. So it includes some of those things that often we'll describe as needed to participate in social life. So things like nowadays it's pretty, you can't get by really without some type of cell phone. And most people require internet in order to even access social programs, for example, and to get information. There's, following the Canadian Living Wage Framework, we've made the assumption that one adult in each household, each reference household, access some adult education, so 2 courses a year or college. The household members participate in local recreation opportunities, some free, but also some for the children that have costs associated with them, like swimming lessons and things like that. And that's all based on the local costs from having contacted people in the community. And then there's some other aspects of social inclusion that are listed here too. Slide 12. So as I indicated, I want to give a little bit more information about the government transfers component. So the government transfer component of the calculation accounts for several key transfer programs. So the biggest one that has the most impact typically on low-income families is the New Canada Child Benefit that's been around since 2016. And then, of course, the NWT also has its NWT Child Benefit. There is also the GST rebate that many low-income families will qualify for typically as well. In this case, the findings show that the biggest source of government income transfer to the reference households in each of the 3 communities is the Canada Child Benefit. In each community, those reference households qualify for over $6,000 through that program. It ranges a little bit across the communities, but it's between $6,000 and $7,000 for each of them. Another key thing to highlight with respect to the government transfers is that because their living wage employment income level is quite high, they actually do not meet the thresholds to qualify for the NWT Child Benefit. So none of those reference households get any amount of transfers through the NWT Child Benefit program, and they do not get any form of GST rebate either. Slide 13. So as described in the calculation methodology, are also accounted for in the calculation approach. So that incorporates, because they are working, they're of course required to pay into CPP as well as EI. So those are the amounts that they need to pay into those programs, are as well as federal and NWT income tax. Net tax across the three households in the communities comes in at between 12,000 to 14,000. It ends up as being highest in Inuvik, which seems counterintuitive, but it is because their net income level comes up somewhat higher because there's lower childcare expense adjustment on their employment income. And anyone who's had kids and done their taxes knows that that childcare adjustment piece on your income is significant. The greatest tax burden for each of the three reference households comes from their federal income tax requirements, and it ranges across the three from between $5,000 to $6,500. And then the next highest part of their tax burden is their CPP. So that is the review of the results for the three communities. And as I mentioned, so slide 14, I wanted to just very briefly talk about and give some context in terms of living wage in other communities across Canada. So although you can't see the detail on this map, it gives you an indication of how many different communities across Canada have recently developed living wage estimates. There is big concentrations in BC and Ontario, but the living wage community has been expanding, and there's certainly estimates have been developed in other communities as well quite recently, and it's certainly an indicator that's spreading in Alberta. And I was just on a call related to the National Living Wage Forum that's reviewing some aspects of the calculation, and our Newfoundland and Labrador is about to engage in a living wage estimate for the first time as well. So there's even some maritime communities starting to look at living wage as well. On to slide 15. So to give you some context, I did pull out some of the more recent living wage estimates that have been published. Again, I want to emphasize that in some cases, living wage will look quite different because, for example, in Alberta, we have a childcare subsidy program that gets, and BC as well, that gets accounted for as one of the government transfer programs in the calculation of living wage because it's a standalone program for government transfers. So keep that in mind too. It does influence some of the living wage estimates. But this does give you a bit of context. So Whitehorse did a living wage estimate in 2017. I believe they will probably update this year. Most communities update every 2 years. And that came in at $18.26. And then you see a range of estimates here. Canmore is the highest in this list, and I did that estimate for them, so I have the knowledge behind why it's so high. So it's so high because rental accommodation rates for families are extremely expensive in that community. Really, it's because investors are buying up those types of accommodations, and it's creating quite a housing market crunch in that community. So that is one of the big drivers of why their living wage is so high. And then Vancouver is Vancouver and Victoria are also two of the higher estimates. So that, onto the last slide, the conclusion slide. So that concludes the review. And as I mentioned, I think we're very open, myself and Suzette are open to questions. I'm just hoping I can hear them okay in order to respond appropriately.
Okay, thank you very much, Michelle, for your presentation. We appreciate the fact that you're able to present this in some detail, and we'll now open the floor to questions. And the chair is back in his chair, so he will conduct the discussion.
Sorry about that. Any questions for Ms. Hayner? Ms. Green?
Thank you. My questions are actually not for Ms. Hayner, but more for Suzette and Ben. I'd like to get an idea of what they plan to do with this information in addition to presenting it to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Who is going to answer?
I'll take a crack at
Okay.
it. Thank you, Chair.
Ms. Monroy?
Thank you for the question. We have put aside some money to hire someone to contact different organizations and businesses to determine who is a living wage employer in the city. So that's a task in itself, really. But the other thing is really this is a tool for us to be able to say where the situation is at in terms of what we expect from wages. And what I like to use as a premise really is here's a situation where we have a couple that's working full-time, and obviously they need either a much higher income than you might anticipate, or we need to do some work on decreasing the cost of living, or we need to look at ways of increasing the subsidies that we give them. So the minimum wage in the NWT is nowhere near a living wage, and this clearly shows how it cannot be. So wages need to go up, but we also need to look at other ways of decreasing the cost of living and increasing subsidies. And I'm just going to say Inuvik is a great example. You see what the impact of having subsidized childcare does, and what the impact of having subsidized healthcare does. So those make a difference to what the living wage needs to be. So that's an important part of the advocacy that we get from this tool.
Thank you, Ms. Monroy. Ms. Green?
Yeah, thank you for that response. That certainly is useful. Have you thought about lobbying for an increase in subsidies, for example, the NWT child benefit? I don't believe that it is indexed, and I also don't believe that it offers very much money to the living wage families because the threshold is so low. So is that something that you're lobbying to have changed?
Thank you, Ms. Green. Ms.
So,
McRae?
sorry, thank you. Yes, thank you for the question. We just learned really in doing this project that people who were getting the living wage would not receive the child subsidy. So that will become part of our lobbying whenever we make presentations on poverty reduction. That'll be, it's important to see that we need to raise the child care subsidy because people who are working full-time will not access it.
Thank you,
If
Monroy.
they're getting a living wage, yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Green.
Nothing further, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'm wondering if I could ask Ms. Hayner a question about carbon pricing. Has there been any thought about how the methodology for calculating a living wage is going to change with carbon pricing? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Ms. Hayner?
No, that hasn't been accounted for. I know that there's some recent, I just don't know the details of the NWT plan for that, so it hasn't been reflected here, but certainly it potentially could be.
Thank you, Ms. Hayner. Mr. O'Reilly. Thanks. Yeah, as MLAs, we're still trying to learn about it ourselves. So maybe I can ask a question of our guests as well, Mr. Chair. And I think there's been some discussion of it, but when you see the three communities, intuitively, people are going to focus on Inuvik and saying, well, why is Inuvik so much lower than the other two places? So maybe you could just summarize that for us. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Who is the... Okay, Ms. Monroy.
So as Michelle mentioned during the presentation, the household couple that we chose was Indigenous, which meant that they had access to the Aboriginal Head Start program, so half of their daycare costs were paid for. So that was a big reduction in their expenses. And the other part was that they were eligible for the non-insured health benefit program, so they didn't have to take out a private health care plan. The other point I would like to make, if possible, is we didn't do the smaller communities. They're very important to us, but the reason that we didn't do the smaller communities is there's not enough data to do a living wage. So, for instance, we use the market basket measure that's done by the NWT Bureau Stats, but they have not yet done any of it for the smaller communities. I would confidently imagine that the living wages would be higher in most of the small communities, for sure. But we just haven't had the capacity yet to calculate them.
Thank you, Mr. Riley.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So without revealing too much about your consultant's costs and so on, how much does it roughly cost to put together something like this? And I'm just trying to get a sense of what the cost is, and whether that's something that our government might start to take on rather than relying on an NGO to do this kind of work. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Riley. Ms. Montre?
Can I ask my consultant if it's okay if I indicate what the cost of the project was?
Okay, Ms. Hayner?
Sure, go for it.
It's just under 7,500. 7,500. Did I say that correctly? Yeah. It's just under that, so.
Okay, thank you.
And I think it's worth every penny, but I do agree that it would be nice to have some assistance in doing this, and we have applied for funding before, and we've been rejected, so.
Thank you, Ms. Montre.
Can I step in and mention something?
Go ahead, Ms. Hayner.
I'm not trying to kill my own business here, but I try to be a nice person. And many of you will know that I used to work I have many friends and many people because I used to work up there. And if that is something the government wanted to do, I would absolutely be willing to sit down with people from the Bureau of Statistics and kind of give them a bit of a coaching on how to do it. They would be able to. They have the skills, I'm sure. With a bit of coaching on the approach and just how it works, I'm sure that it could be done internally at some point in time.
Thank you, Ms. Hayner. Small supplementary, Mr. Riley?
No, I'm okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Riley. Mr. Nahendeh?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I see the value in coming up with a statistical figure in terms of just the wages and the services in terms of living in small communities. So, but it's interesting in terms of the point that was made in terms of the counterintuitive figures that there's the assumption as, like in an NWT, the more south that you live and closer to infrastructure, like the transportation industry, then you'd assume that the cost of goods would be lower, but it's actually not the case. I think I understand just maybe the challenges in terms of securing figures for smaller communities, but maybe it's really a question for the consultant whether it's practical to maybe undertake a similar exercise for none of it. I mean, it's isolated, it's remote, there's no large industry there, but I mean, it'd be interesting to have figures from none of it as well reflected, at least in that map. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Nahendeh. Ms. Montre?
Thank you. If I could just say, we didn't do any of the data collection. We just use data that was prepared by the Bureau of Statistics or Stats Canada. So we wouldn't have the capacity to go out and collect the data. So that kind of question could be posed to the Bureau of Statistics. And I have to say they have been amazing to work with. So really congratulate their work.
Thank you, Mr. Nahendeh?
No, that's it.
That's it? Okay, thank you. One question, when you look at transportation there, in Yellowknife, they have the bus system, but in Yellowknife and Hay River, they don't. So how did you guys encompass transportation into this calculation? Ms. Montre?
I'll let Michelle answer that
Okay,
one.
Ms. Hayner?
Yeah, I'll answer that one. So, and that's a very good question. So, in our assumptions, we assume that the reference households that were reflected in today's presentation for the couple families own a private vehicle. And that's the same assumption that was made in the transportation component for the NWT market basket measures. So we use those costs. However, for the other reference households that were reflected in the broader report, so the lone parent family with one child and the single adult, we do make assumptions that account for the existence of public transit options in Yellowknife. So that does, if you look through the report, it affects the cost for Yellowknife on transportation and makes them lower than for the other communities. So it is accounted for the other reference households. And then if you can, for other communities across Canada where they've done living wage estimates and there's really well-developed public transit options, they kind of make that assumption at the local level and they may reflect that in their cost estimates. If it's determined that it's reasonable that a family with 2 children would use public transit for one or both of the parents and the children. It's sort of something that the living wage framework allows some flexibility on depending on local realities.
Thank you, Ms. Hayner. Yeah, and as for the market basket, I actually had my office, actually, we did that for our smaller communities so we could get that information out to stats, WT stats, because we got their basket and we formalized that information. So it's quite interesting to see that information, especially for the smaller communities. So, and it took us a little while to get the information as we move forward, and we made some assumptions that, as we move forward. So, and we shared that with leadership in the communities, and that was thanks to the anti-poverty workshop that we attended. It was something that was very interesting. So, any other questions for that? Seeing none, I'd like to thank you very much for coming in. I realize we're a little bit delayed, but I thank you very much for your patience, and thank you very much for attending here and presenting this, and thank you very much for this great information. I mean, and do you have any closing comments?
Well, maybe Fort Simpson could be our next calculation if you've done the market basket measure work. That would be a great project.
We can work with
Or Bureau Stats could be trained to do it,
Yeah.
one or the other. But thank you for letting us present today, and enjoy the last day and have a good rest after that. So.
Thank you very much. We will call this portion of the meeting done, and then.
Thanks, Michelle.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, thank you,
Yeah.
Michelle.
Thank you.